Welcome to the Portland Press Herald podcast. This week on the podcast, Senator Angus King sits down with the editorial board. Speaking with the senator, publisher and CEO Lisa DeSisto, Portland Press Herald editorial page editor Greg Kesich, Kennebec Journal and Morning Sentinel editorial page editor Ben Bragdon, Portland Press Herald assistant editorial page editor Sarah Collins, Portland Press Herald news columnist Bill Nemitz, and Portland Press Herald reporter Noel Gallagher. Also present in the room, Senator King's aide Scott Ogden, whose name is mentioned a couple of times.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned about people working from home. I've got an idea.
Okay.
New idea. And I didn't mean to. I mean, I suppose I ought to wait and make an announcement or something. Look at Scott. Did you see that look he just gave me? But seriously, I've been talking to people, and I'm throwing this out not necessarily for its news value, but just for your thinking. We all talk about bringing factories here and bringing businesses here. Why not go to businesses in Dubuque or Portland, Oregon or something and say, we've got people, they can work at home. I mean, we've got companies now, Unum has a whole lot of people that work at home. Mm-hmm. Why not make that an economic development push? I haven't figured out quite what to call it yet, but do you see what I mean? Instead of saying you've got to move your factory or your office here and build a building and get permits and everything, just hire people.
Call it more broadband.
Yeah, that's one of the pieces for sure, and that's one of the things that makes that urgent. Because if we don't fix that, if we're successful, all those jobs will be in the areas that already are pretty hot. But I because you always get into this whole thing of tax benefits and free land and free buildings and stuff, and this is a way to avoid all of that. It can be a lot easier, and I'll bet you there are several thousand of people in Maine now that work at home. LL Bean has them. Anthem has a bunch of their people working at home. And this could be a way, and it could do rural areas if we can get the broadband. Anyway, that's today's.
No, we love that idea. We've written about it. We actually had a forum about it, and I think it's transitioned from being called telecommuting to working in place.
Okay, that's like aging in place.
Aging.
You can age and work at the same time.
Yeah.
Well, that happens.
And the other thing is, during a snowstorm, you go to work in your PJs.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, I'm at your disposal.
So, 6 weeks or so after this election, we're still trying to figure out what happened, and I wonder what your take on it is. What happened?
Well, I did a presentation in Washington a couple of weeks ago about the election, or at least touching on. Actually, it was about broadband, and I had two big maps drawn. Not drawn, but I got them on the internet and had them blown up. One was the areas of the country that don't have broadband, and the other was the election results. And there's an overlap. Not that people without broadband voted for Trump, but that rural areas voted for Trump overwhelmingly, and it's rural areas that lack broadband. And my connection was, because this conference was about broadband, was that in rural areas, people feel left out. They feel not listened to, not cared about, not responded to, and one little piece of it is they can't get broadband. But they also don't feel that they're being heard politically. I mean, if you Scott, just in the car, we were talking about where Trump's votes were in Maine. I mean, what the election was in Maine, and it's startling. There's blue along the coast. Everything else is red. And to me, it presents even no matter who won. Let's say Hillary had won, it would have, another 100,000 votes in Michigan or Wisconsin. But the issue is still there of the division, of a division in the country, of people who, for whatever reason, feel alienated from institutions, the media, the government, the universities, the school. All there's this alienation that is really disturbing and dangerous. And I think we have to be thinking about it in a whole lot of different ways. But everybody has written about what happened and why. But people just, they wanted change. There have only been, I think, 2 presidents in American history where one party has gone beyond 8 years in the White House. It's only happened, I think, twice, maybe 3 times. So Hillary started out swimming upstream against the historical tide. And I remember watching the results on election night, and about 7 o'clock, CNN reported their first exit poll, not of votes, but of issues, and they said something like 82% of the people wanted change. And I remember thinking at the time, this is bad news for Hillary. And here's another I'll share with you, because you think about these things. People were looking for a different approach, and their disaffection and anger and disconnection didn't necessarily have anything to do with government, but this election was the only way they could express it. Do you see what I mean? A paper machine closing in northern Maine has to do with international, the exchange rate and demand for coated paper and all that. But you don't get to vote for the president of the paper company, or that kind of thing. So it all focused on the government as being the. Do you see what I mean? People were mad at global forces, but the only way they had to express it was this election. That's at least some of my thinking about it.
Do you think people are more polarized than they used to be?
Yes.
Ideologically?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I don't think of Trump as an ideological guy. I think he is who he is. I don't even think of him so much as a Republican. He's Trump. I mean, he's going to agree. I think the idea that the Republicans are going to be able to sort of dust off all the things they've been talking about for 20 years and he's going to be their guy, I don't think that's going to occur. It might, in some ways, in some areas. But for example, the best example is trade. Free trade. The TPA passed the Congress overwhelmingly with Republican votes. There were Democratic votes, but the fast track, the TPA that's the fast track authority that preceded the TPP. If you go back and look at that vote, I think you'd find it was overwhelmingly Republican. They've always been, on the forefront of free trade and free trade agreements. The Democrats have been reluctant because of labor's concerns, and so his position on that is definitely not the conventional Republican position. So I don't think it's ideological in the traditional sense of Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative. I think it's much more deep-seated.
What do you think happens when a lot of the promises that Trump made to these alienated voters run into reality?
That's a really good question.
I guess I'm thinking, is there a chance for people on the other side to reach out to those voters in a way that's going to resonate with them?
My guess is it's not going to matter much. His supporters are so committed to him as a person that it would be hard to pry them. I mean, I think, for example, if he isn't able to get done what he gets done, the response will be, well, that's because the Democrats didn't let him.
It's more about how he says things rather than what he says, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, that, again, I'm just being honest. I think that's he said during the campaign, I could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and not lose any votes, and I think that was probably true.
What are your thoughts on the transition so far, or some might say the lack thereof? For example, have you had any contact with a representative of the administration to date?
No.
And what are your thoughts, for example, the intelligence briefings? It's the hot one this week, that he's just not doing this. Does that concern you as a member of the Intelligence Committee?
It does, because one of the things, this will sound funny. One of the things I've learned since I've been down there for 4 years, it's really important who the president is. And, that seems, totally obvious, except it's more important than I thought, because the president has to make so many unilateral decisions, particularly in foreign policy. The Congress has largely abdicated its responsibility in foreign policy, and the president has become pretty much the sole arbiter of. And it's not only war and peace. It's do we station THAAD missiles in Poland? Do we deploy special forces to Syria? Do we put an aircraft carrier in the South China Sea? I mean, those are all very important decisions. And my concern about the intelligence briefing issue is I think he's doing a disservice to himself. In the sense that he's going to have to make those kinds of decisions, and they're going to be made based upon intelligence assessments. And in my experience from being on the Intelligence Committee, I want the most unfiltered analysis from the professionals that I can get. I don't want it going through 2 other people before it gets to me. And that's why I've gone out of my way to go to classified briefings. And I sat all 1 week every night for 3 or 4 hours and read the entire 500 pages of the torture summary because I wanted to see the data. Otherwise, you're dependent on other people. I read a very good piece this morning in Politico about Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the importance of Kennedy getting his own analysis and understanding what was really going on, because he'd made the mistake in the Bay of Pigs a year earlier of taking the advice of the generals and the head of the CIA without getting into the guts of the facts. And in the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was very deeply involved in getting the direct information. And that's why I think not taking those briefings is a mistake. And I'm not saying that critically. I'm saying it. I think he's making a mistake for his own purposes, because if he's going to be called upon to make very important decisions with long-term ramifications, and in that situation, he ought to have all the information he can possibly get, as unfiltered as he can possibly get it. Now, apparently I've talked to people down there. Every president's had their own style. Nixon apparently never took, or rarely took the daily briefings. He got everything through Kissinger. Kissinger took the daily briefings. Other presidents have taken them occasionally and not every day. But to me, it's particularly with the world as complex and dangerous as it is, I'd want to get that. That's really unfortunate. I can tell you, because I don't get a daily brief; I get a weekly split between he and the intelligence agencies. It's a depressing way to start off Monday morning, because they're his eyes and ears. I think like I say, you're going to have to make he's defensive about this situation, and understandably, but. To dismiss the entire intelligence community as ridiculous or politically driven. This is really inside baseball, but Jim Clapper, General Clapper, who's the Director of National Intelligence, that's a position that was created after September 11th because of the stovepipe problem, where we had all these agencies that didn't talk to each other, so they created one coordinating entity at the top. He's the guy that issued the statement on October 7th, which I commend to you, is the heart of what we now know. And it said 5 things. It said the entire intelligence community, 17 agencies, not just the CIA. A lot of the news of the last week has been the CIA. This statement was the Director of National Intelligence and the head of Homeland Security. And it said 5 things. It said, we have confidence that the Russians are behind this, that they are also behind the leaks to WikiLeaks and DC leaks, that their intent is to interfere, that's the word they used, interfere with the elections, and that the orders to do so came from the, quote, highest levels of the Russian government. The fifth item was that they also have tried to hack into state election processes. To me, that's pretty close to indisputable. I've read a lot of intelligence briefs, and this is one of the least equivocal that I've seen. It's typical to have, we believe, it appears that, we have moderate confidence. This one is very unequivocal, which was unusual. And Jim Clapper has worked in intelligence for the federal government of the United States for 53 years. He goes back to Vietnam era. He was in the military. He's served presidents of all. He is the definition of a nonpartisan professional, and to dismiss something that he said is ridiculous, to coin a phrase, simply because, see, what I meant by inside baseball, most people don't have the benefit that I have of having gotten to know him and spent time with him and understand his inherent credibility. It's true Obama appointed him, but like I say, over 50 years of experience, and I can tell you he's this crusty guy that, he's the last person you would expect to be partisan. So to have this split is really, I think, unfortunate, because how else is the president going to learn what's going on? And if he doesn't trust the information he's getting from the people whose job it is to produce that information, I don't know where you turn to get your information upon which to make decisions. So I hope and suspect that as he gets into the job, he'll learn, who he can trust, and that these people are in fact professionals, and they're going to give him their best information.
Can you put the Russian hack into context for us? And historically,
yeah.
What do you think it means?
Okay, that's a really good question, and I think it's an important question. Last March, I went with half a dozen members of the Intelligence Committee to Eastern Europe for a visit on what's what we're seeing over there, and it was. I should back up and say I'm not a big congressional traveler, but I go where I think I can learn something. And I went with Tim Kaine, as a matter of fact, to Pakistan. And we walked into this meeting, and this senior Pakistani guy said, "I know why you gentlemen are here." I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Because one day of seeing is better than 30 days of reading." And I thought, that's a pretty interesting insight. So anyway, we went to Ukraine and Poland. We then went to Paris. We were in Paris the day of the Brussels airport attack and spent the day with French intelligence, which was really fascinating, and then to Berlin. But anyway, we got to Poland, and the first thing they wanted to talk about was Russia messing around with their elections, and that they were under a constant barrage of Russian disinformation, propaganda, all designed to undermine the public's confidence in Western values, America, and the democratic process. We went to Ukraine and heard exactly the same thing. Then 2 weeks ago, we had a delegation at the Armed Services Committee from 3 Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. They said exactly the same thing. We are under constant assault from the Russians, and what you have just experienced is exactly what we've been working on and dealing with for years. And I then said to them, I actually came late to the meeting, which was fortunate because the meeting had broken up. I got there, and I got them all to myself for about a half hour. And I said, "So what do you do about it?" Well, you can't shut down the internet. We can't close off access to information. They said, the best thing that we've found is for the public to know what's going on, because then they can take it with a grain of salt. They can say, "Oh yeah, that's just the Russians again." Do you see what I mean? And that's why I've been pushing for public hearings. the American people have to know that this is a fact of life. And we can try to defend ourselves against hacking and all that kind of thing. But this is absolutely consistent with the Russian standard operating procedure in other parts of the world. And what they did here was, it was consistent. And I'm not a computer forensics guy, but when the entire 17 agencies of the intelligence community says we have confidence this was the Russians and they have reasons. Now here's a challenge. I was listening to a call-in show yesterday, and somebody called in and said, well, I want to see the proof. How do you prove that the Russians did it? The problem with that is you can't prove it without revealing your intelligence sources and methods. You know, the famous case of Churchill not warning Coventry that they were going to be bombed, which was a huge moral dilemma, but he knew it because they'd broken the German codes, but he didn't want Germany to know we'd broken the codes. That would have been a larger problem. So this is, how do we demonstrate to the American people, how does the intelligence community do it without giving away how they know it? Do you see that? That's a challenge. And that's what Susan Collins has said something about. She's in favor of public hearings subject to national security. That's what she means. That's the issue.
You seem to think, though, that there is more that can be revealed based on your call for declassification
Yes.
of some of the information. What's the risk-benefit there for you? Is it all benefit, no risk, or do you call for declassification understanding that there's going to be a price to pay?
No, the call for declassification is subject to concerns of national security. Everything doesn't have to be classified. In fact, I think there are a lot of things that are classified that shouldn't be. So I think, the president and the director of national intelligence and the agencies can decide. I think there are things they can release, just as they did on October 7th. That was the document I just quoted was public, and they released that information without compromising sources and methods, and I think there's more that they can release and should, and that was why. But my motivation for that was that until the American people understand that this is happening, we can't adequately cope with it. We can't defend ourselves in effect. So, I think there is opportunity for declassification without compromising national security.
What about what you said earlier, though, about Trump's people are going to stick with him come hell or high water. And the people who didn't vote for Trump, I would guess right now, don't need a whole lot of convincing about the Russian involvement in the election. So the question is, even with more disclosure, do you think it's possible to persuade Trump's base, as we call it, that there is sinister
Something.
Russian involvement here, or will they just listen to him and take their cues from him that it's all a bunch of baloney?
I think some will. I think we can't assume that every Trump voter is the same. I mean, I have friends who voted for Trump simply because they didn't like Hillary. They're not particularly enamored of Trump, so I think they're open-minded to learn things that are important. There are going to be people who are never going to be convinced. Everything is a plot, and I'm getting calls, you're trying to delegitimize the election, and this is all a Democratic plot, and it's Hillary's behind it. If somebody thinks that, it's sort of hard to convince them that it's not the case. In my case, it's based upon my confidence in Jim Clapper. And what I've learned about our intelligence services is that they are extremely professional. Most of them are career people. They're not partisan. They're not political. If anything, I suppose, I don't really know this, but I suppose they would tend toward being more conservative. They're public servants. They risk their lives. I mean, I've been in places where the local intelligence people risk their lives every time they go out for lunch. I mean, I'm amazed at the patriotism of these people. Whenever I come back from one of these trips, Mary says, well, what did you learn? And the first thing I comment on is the quality of the people that we have working for us who we don't treat all that well. Remember, President Kennedy did Bay of Pigs. I mean, there's a learning process for everybody. There would be for any of us. And we must hope that what provides the learning is not a world-shattering catastrophe.
What do you think the motivation is for undermining elections in other countries?
Now you're asking me to read Putin's mind. Yeah. I would commend to you a speech that Putin made, oh God. It was around the time of the annexation of Crimea. And it's public. It's about 8 pages long. And it talks about sort of what drives him. It's very interesting. And in fact, it was suggested to me by a CIA Russian analyst. And we tend to not understand the culture and history of our adversaries very well, or of anybody else for that matter. Russia has historically had a deep-seated suspicion and paranoia about the West, going back to Frederick the Great. And a primary impetus to Russian foreign policy has always been to establish itself of what it believes is its rightful place among the leading nations of the world. And a kind of inferiority complex may not be the right term, but a kind of paranoia about the West, which isn't all that irrational. Exhibit A is Napoleon and Exhibit B is Hitler. You know, they've been invaded twice in the last 200 years and attempted to be subjugated. So Putin comes out of that, and plus you have the dismantlement of the Soviet Union, which many people in Russia, including Putin, feel was the greatest catastrophe of the 21st century, and was a huge insult and terrible event in the history of Russia. So he's trying to restore Greater Russia. I don't know. Well, I was about to say I don't know whether that includes territory, but it certainly includes the Crimea. And it certainly includes some influence or influence plus in the bordering states, Ukraine, Poland, Baltics. And one way to do that is to undermine the confidence of those states in the West and Western values so that they will fall more under the orbit of Russia. And in many of those states, of course, there are a lot of Russian speakers. Now, I asked the Baltics people, I said, is this an issue in your countries like it was in the Crimea and in Ukraine? And they said, no, we have Russian speakers, but they're not oriented toward Russia as a kind of loyalty. But I think the answer to your question is this is part of a long-term strategy to reestablish Russia as a hegemonic power in the region, if not the world.
So for, 25 years now, we've been saying that there's only one superpower in the world. Is Russia a superpower now?
Yes, but they have the weapons. They don't have the economy. Their primary weakness is the economy. I also think Putin knows what every politician knows, and that is if you're not doing well domestically, point people to foreign policy. Margaret Thatcher's approval rating the day before the Falklands War was 23%. 2 weeks later, it was 70%. That's been true since Roman times, at least. And so I think, and the Russian economy is in such bad shape that I think clearly the conscious or unconscious strategy is to focus on muscle flexing abroad in order to maintain popularity at home. Putin's approval rating is something like 80%. Now, how long will that last as the economy continues to weaken? Who knows? I keep asking, how long do they have before it absolutely hits the wall? I don't get clear answers, but let me tell you one other quick story. I met a guy, I don't know, it was 10 or 15 years ago, who was about my age, and you meet somebody, where are you from? He says, well, I grew up in California, but I was born in Japan. He was American, and I did the calculation, realized he was born in Japan in the mid to late 40s. I said, that's interesting. How did you happen to be in Japan? He said, my father was a professor who was an expert in the history and culture of Japan. And MacArthur hired him to come to Japan and help him write the Constitution of Japan after the war, because he wanted the Constitution to be consistent with the history and culture of the country. That's brilliant. We don't do that enough. We are constantly think that other people in the world think as we do. They're very different. I mean, Vietnam is an example. The Middle East is an example. I mean, we go in and, we've stumbled into two civil wars, one that's been going on for 1,200 years and the other 2,000 years. The wars between Sunni and Shias, and the other is the Iran and the Persians and the Arabs. That goes back to Darius the Great. And we sort of think of things in a kind of linear, European, neat, and I don't think we fully understand the culture of these countries. To try to assume that you can airdrop democracy into a country that hasn't ever experienced it for 2,000 years, and it'll take in a couple of years, is it's going to be very difficult. So anyway, that's king on foreign policy.
Okay.
Sorry.
Are we going to see a healthcare bill?
Huh?
Are we going to see a healthcare bill?
This is one of my principal concerns. It's repeal and chaos. I'm very cynical about repeal and replace, because we've had 6 years to come up with a replacement plan that hasn't yet surfaced. And the idea of repeal, I think the latest idea is we'll repeal today, but it won't take effect for 3 years, and then we'll come up with something. That's terrible policy on two levels. Number one, once you vote repeal, you're going to have chaos in the market. Insurance companies are going to say, well, why are we doing this? And, we're going to get out of this. This isn't the future. Hospitals are not going to know what's happening. Citizens aren't going to know. They're, the 84,000 people in Maine who are on the Affordable Care Act, they're not going to know. So you're going to have the idea that somehow you're going to vote repeal, but everybody's going to go on as they do now for 3 years until that's just doesn't pass the straight face test. And the other question is, if you haven't come up with a replacement in 6 years, what makes you think you're going to come up with one in 3 years? I think it's. On the other hand, I think they're victims of their own rhetoric, that they've got to do this, and people expect them to do it. I'm going to certainly oppose it in every way I possibly can, because I believe since the day I went down there that there are things in the Affordable Care Act we should change. But the problem is the opposition has never wanted to do any fixing. None. All they've wanted to talk about is repeal. And yet now they're trying to cherry pick, saying, well, there's some things we're going to keep, like no pre-existing conditions. But we hate those mandates. You can't have one without the other. If you have a rule that says you can't deny someone health insurance because of a pre-existing condition, but there isn't any mandate to buy insurance, nobody would buy insurance until they're in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. The two are inextricably linked. And to try to say we're going to have no pre-existing conditions and you can stay on your parents' policy until you're 26, but we're going to repeal all these taxes, and it doesn't work as a response. And I don't understand the impulse to take insurance away from people. Okay, we've got 20 million people that have it. We've got another 10 or 15 that don't for whatever reason, and that's what our target ought to be, and we ought to figure out a way to make that work. A system that leaves 40 to 50 million people uninsured is just wrong. People die when they don't have insurance because they don't get checkups. I'm alive because I had insurance, because I went and got a routine checkup in 1974 because my health insurance policy had routine checkups were free, and they discovered melanoma, and I got it treated within a month or so, had surgery, and I'm here. And you guys, I mean, melanoma is something which you catch it in time, you're okay, and if you don't, it's very dangerous. Did yours start with melanoma, Bill?
Well, that's the latest one, yeah.
Okay.
But it had spread. But you're right. I wouldn't be here without a doubt.
Yeah,
Without insurance.
without insurance. And
No, not a chance.
and there actually, Harvard School of Public Health did a study that, and I don't remember the number, but there's a number of people per thousand that will die without health insurance. So I think there will be a bill. I don't know what it's going to do. I don't think its passage is all that sure. You know, they're talking about using budget reconciliation as the vehicle for repeal because it only requires a majority vote. But only 3 Republicans can stop that. It won't, you know.
Care to drop any names?
No, but it's so I don't think it's a dead. It's a cinch that it's going to be repealed. And then, of course, you get to the idea of voucherizing Medicare, which did you see Ann Coulter's tweet about that?
No.
Ann Coulter tweeted. She said, "Paul Ryan, if you want to voucherize," she said, "Paul Ryan, we didn't run on voucherizing Medicare. If that's what you want to do, you run and see how it goes." I don't often agree with Ann Coulter, but I thought that's put it pretty succinctly. Clearly, I'll fight against that. So I think it remains to be seen what they actually propose and whether Republican senators who have 50, 100, 200, 300,000 insured people in their state are going to really say, yeah, we're going to cut this off.
What did the other senators say when you say that to them about people die when they don't have health insurance, and what's the point of taking away insurance?
They don't really have a response. It's sort of like what they say when I hand them my card that talks about climate change. Well, okay, change the subject. And it's, but the other piece I think that will have a political effect is hospitals are going to be in real bad shape, particularly in states that are rural and have a lot of smaller hospitals to refill. And I've asked this is something you guys might want to do some research on. If you take, and I've asked this of some Maine hospitals, but I haven't gotten the answer yet. If you take 100 patients, how many are under private insurance, how many under Medicaid, how many Medicare, and how many Affordable Care Act? Because you take the Affordable Care Act away, you're throwing those people back onto charity care, which raises everybody's rates, but it also threatens the viability of these hospitals. I think it's going to be very tough on particularly rural hospitals. And that could create a political backlash, if you will, in favor of retaining the bill. I mean, the hospitals are getting paid for things they used to do for free. And a lot of these rural hospitals are, not, it's a very tight situation financially.
I was going to ask you your thoughts on the appointment of Perry for energy. You were talking about who if he's not listening to the people already in those positions.
Is it true that energy was the
Yes.
agency Perry couldn't remember?
Yes.
That was one he couldn't remember.
That was the one no, he couldn't remember
Yeah.
energy.
Energy?
That was the third one.
Was it the third one?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought it was,
They'll give him cards this time. It'll
Okay.
say energy.
Let me give you my philosophy about confirmation starting. As a former governor, I start with the premise that the executive should be able to choose the people they want. So that's my starting point. On the other hand, I find it troubling to have people appointed to lead an agency that they expressly disagree with the mission of the agency, or in this case, think the agency should be abolished. That's troubling. The other piece about the Department of Energy is people think of it as, do we do coal or gas or whatever. It has huge responsibilities for the national labs and for the national nuclear enterprise. That's not widely known, but that's a major part. The Department of Energy is where Los Alamos and Sandia and Lawrence Livermore and Oak Ridge, all of those are huge national assets, and they are under the Department of Energy, and we're in the midst of talking about modernizing the nuclear deterrent, and that's going to be a key part of it. So it's not just do you like coal or do you like natural gas or oil. There's a second level that is very technical and complex. I don't start with I've met Rick Perry. He and I served together as governors for 2 years. He took over for George W. Bush as governor of Texas when George W. was elected president in 2000, and I was governor until 2002. So I knew him at conferences and stuff. So I don't start. I'm not a sure no vote, but I'm pretty sure his hearings will be before the committee that I'm on, Energy and Natural Resources. So I plan to ask a lot of questions, and my determination will be, how will you steward this important agency that plays a significant role in the future of the country? So I guess you would put me down as I don't know quite how to put it. Open-minded but skeptical. How's that?
Same go for Tillerson?
Yes, for different reasons. Because of Russia is an adversary. There are areas where we can work together with them, and I'd be delighted if we can. Do you remember Obama said we were going to have a reset with Russia? But then we had the Ukraine, we had Crimea, we had Aleppo, we had the Baltics, So I am worried about the Russian connection and the depth of those ties, and I think that's a fair characterization. I don't know the man. I've never met him. I'm afraid on CNN last week I sang the praises of Corker, and I'm afraid I may have done him in.
Because of that.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to figure, you mentioned a little bit at the beginning, whether this Trump administration is, going to be kind of a normal Republican or...
And I don't think it is.
Or something... It's certainly unique, or,
Yes.
I don't like that word, but, unique. And
I think the nearest analogy is Andrew Jackson.
Because, looking at all these stories, the people he's brought in, his own disinterest in a lot of the things, and that can change, we get in, hope it does, but, I got to talk myself out of building a doomsday shelter once a day. Where are you? How do you...
Well, I'm a congenital optimist, and one of my principles of life is you got to play the hand that's dealt you. And so what I'm going to do is look for areas of agreement and fight like hell with areas of disagreement. For example, I have been critical of our position on trade. I wrote an essay for the Bowdoin Week, daily online publication in 2010, I think, criticizing our trade policy, saying I didn't think it took cognizance of American workers and that we just didn't drive very good deals. And that's an area where I might think, I think we can find some agreement. Same thing as one of the first things he's talked about is infrastructure. I think that's a very important priority, and broadband has to be part of that discussion. to me, broadband is just like a highway or a bridge. It's infrastructure. And so part of my orientation is going to be to convince the president and the administration that if they do some major infrastructure project, it ought to involve broadband, particularly in rural areas. So I see those as potential areas of agreement. And, I don't know what he's going to do about health care and the Affordable Care Act. And I'm in favor of border security. That doesn't mean build a wall, but it means, there's work in what a lot of people don't realize in the big comprehensive immigration bill that the Senate passed by 70-some votes 3 years ago. There was a big piece on border security. I mean, it was a lot of money. I think they're going to. Like I say, I'm a congenital optimist, and I'm going to try to find areas of agreement. But I'm sure there were going to be areas of disagreement, in which case I'll be my usual charming self.
What about his business interests?
That's a concern. The problem is that his business is so personal, and normally. For example, when I was elected governor, I put everything into a blind trust, but that was fairly easy because it consisted of stocks and bonds and those kinds of things, and I wouldn't know what was going on. I mean, in fact, the only time I remember I saw the person who ran it once at a party, and I said, "Do we have any Enron?" I couldn't resist, and she gave a great answer. She said, "No," and the reason is, she says, "I never invest in anything that I can't figure out how they make money," and she was prescient on that. But anyway, you see, you can't if the business is Trump. The only real way to insulate is to liquidate it and take the money and put it somewhere and let a trustee do it. And I don't think he's going to be willing to do that. I don't know. It's going to be very difficult. For example, Trump Hotel in Washington is leased from the federal government. And the person who's the other side of the lease, he appoints, the head of the GSA. Also, what are the interests in other countries? And how it's going to be very difficult. I just saw today that he's put off, he had said there would be a press conference on December 15th on all this issue. That's now been postponed till January. I think it's a very difficult problem. And I think this is going to be similar for Mr. Tillerson. I mean, he can say, okay, I'm out of ExxonMobil, but it's going to be hard to sort of unencumber oneself from 40 years of investment and of time, energy, and emotional effort in the oil and gas business. But at least, he can say, okay, we're going to sell all our Exxon stock, and then we're going to have a blind trust, and somebody will administer it, and they can buy Apple or whatever. But I think it's going to be hard, and turning it over to your children doesn't really answer it, because you're benefiting your children if you do something. The only other option is absolute full disclosure of everything, every arrangement and deal, and let the public decide whether they think the president's being motivated by personal gain or by the national interest. But it's a very tough situation. It's almost a unique situation where you've had a chief executive who has interests that are so specific. So,
get back to your earlier answer about dealing with the Trump administration. Do you think, how do you think it's your posture with the administration is going to be affected if, in fact, your opponent in 2018 is a guy who has been in lockstep with Trump for some time now? Do you think that, will that be a disadvantage for you politically? Will they be out to get you?
That's too complicated for me to figure out. No, I'm going to, my relationship with the Trump administration will be, as I said, support where I think it's the right thing and opposition where it isn't. And I do think that I think you're going to find votes that are all over the place on Trump initiatives. They're not going to be party line votes. There will be some. But I think a lot you're going to find odd coalitions there are plenty of people on the Democratic side that are skeptical of our trade policy. And you could find a situation where you have Democrats supplying the majority on some issue in that regard. So no, I'm just gonna, do what I've always done, which is try to figure out what the right thing is. And
Well, how do you feel, to follow up on that, how do you feel about the prospect of LePage candidacy?
Life is too short to speculate. I've got a pretty intense job, and that's what I'm going to do. I had a formative experience as governor in the first 3 months, and I can't remember the specifics, but I was presented with a decision. And it had something, as I recall, it had to do with where a bridge should be. And I remember the transportation people came in to brief me about, where should this bridge be as between several towns. And at the end of the briefing, they said, and Governor, whichever way you decide, people are going to be mad as hell. Either way, no matter what. And I remember having a conscious thought, well, if that's the case, I may as well just do what I think is the right thing and not worry, knowing that whatever you do is going to make some people happy and some people angry. And that was what I tried to do as governor, and it worked pretty well. And so that's going to be my approach. And we'll just see what the future holds. I have no idea. You guys probably know as well as I do who may or may not run. Look at Scott; he's getting uneasy. He's getting distinctly uneasy. But no, I'm going to just keep doing. And I think it's important where you can to be supportive of the President of the United States. We've been through a period where it's been so divided, and we started our discussion about division, and it's unhealthy for the country. And I think what the Republicans did to Obama of deciding on the first week that they were going to oppose everything he did, no matter what, was wrong. And I think if the Democrats do the same thing now with regard to Trump, that's wrong. And I've talked to Chuck Schumer about it as recently as the last couple of days, and that's not his approach. His approach is we're going to work with the president when we can, but we're going to pick places. There are places where we're going to oppose, but it's not going to be an unthinking blanket policy, and that's the way I feel.
Any danger that that's the wrong way to go? I mean, I
Yeah.
hear you. I think Washington would be a better place doing it the second way, but
Well, a lot of people argue. I mean, when Chuck said that, he got a lot of flack from the left saying, they didn't cooperate with Obama. Why would you cooperate with Trump? Because the standard should be what's good for the country. If Trump comes upon a policy that was good for the country that would be helpful and useful and important, I'm not going to say no just because it's Trump. I'm sorry. I guess that's not the way I'm made. I don't have that gene. So I guess I don't accept the question because I assume that the decision, unless you assume that it's better for the country to just say no to everything, I think, frankly, that would be playing into Trump's hands. Because then he would say, I tried to fix these things, and the Democrats wouldn't let me.
Where have we heard that before?
Yeah.
When George Bush was president, George W. Bush, and the Republicans had both houses of Congress, there were more moderate Republicans, and there was more bipartisanship. When the Democrats took control of Congress and then the White House, the Republican Party seemed to shift to the left. I mean, to the right. To the right. Thank you. Yeah, and could you see the same thing happening in reverse with the Democrats?
Yes.
If you have a lot of sort of vulnerable moderates up for re-election in 2 years.
There are a lot of Democrats who feel that Hillary lost because she wasn't left enough.
Right.
Bernie Bernie's people. Yeah, I think there is. There's I have it in my phone. There's a fascinating chart that was in the Washington Post about overlap in the Congress that's in the House, and it goes back to 1982. And in 1982, there were something like 300 House members out of the 435. No, it was about 250, where the most conservative Democrat and the most liberal Republican, there was about 200 people in that space. Now there are 4. There's no, and when I worked in the Senate 40 years ago, there was an overlap of about 20. There were Democrats like John Stennis of Mississippi, and there were Republicans like Jacob Javits of New York. Now there is literally no overlap in the Senate. There's still space between Susan Collins and Joe Manchin, and so that's a real problem. However, as long as most major initiatives require 60 votes, it's going to take 8 or 10 Democrats, or Democrats plus independents, to reach 60. So there's got to be some negotiation on appointments, on legislation, and that's going to be a really here's the interesting political question of this year. Will the Republicans abolish the filibuster? And that's going to be there if the Democrats use it every single time, I think the pressure on the Republicans to do so will be intense and probably irresistible. If it's only used in major and important issues, then I think there are voices in the Republican caucus who will say, no, this would be a bad idea. I got to tell you, when I first arrived in January of 2013, there was a strong movement. I remember being on the phone with Tom Udall before I was even sworn in, among newer members of the Democratic caucus, to abolish the filibuster or to change it in some way. The whole 60 votes, they're blocking the president, they're blocking the agenda, this isn't the American way, it's not majority, it's not in the Constitution, all those things. And I was pretty sympathetic to that. And we had a caucus. A caucus lunch in January or February of 2013, and there was all this energy, everybody standing up, we got to do this, we got to do this. And then Carl Levin from Michigan, liberal lion, stood up and said, no, times can change. If you make this change, there'll be a time when you wished you hadn't. And Barbara Boxer stood up and seconded him, and Dianne Feinstein. Nobody could say these are, disloyal Democrats or, conservatives or something. These were some, and they were right, because here we are. And the 60-vote majority requirement, as frustrating as it is, requires some level of bipartisan discussion in order to get anything done. And I've decided that that's not a bad thing. And I decided before the Republicans took over. I was persuaded by Carl. And here we are. If other than the 60-vote threshold in the Senate, there is no break now on the government. And we all learn in school about checks and balances. There's no check. When George W. Bush was president, I remember saying this is the closest we've ever come to a parliamentary democracy, because the Congress was so closely aligned with the president that it was like a parliamentary system where the prime minister is the leader of the parliament. So that's going to be, and I think there are going to be people, and I think Mitch McConnell is one of them, who understand the danger of changing the rule, because times do change and the shoe can be on the other foot. But as I say, if the Democrats use the power every single time, I think the pressure to abolish it is going to be almost irresistible.
I mean, if they use it the way Mitch McConnell used it? I mean, if they use it the way Mitch McConnell used it?
Yes.
Okay.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
I had one more question I just got to ask you while you're here. I'm sorry, Scott.
That's
Because I've been thinking about this. How do you think history treats Obama?
Well, I think it'll be a while. I mean, I think there are criticisms, some that are legitimate. but I think he will be looked upon as a guy who was very engaged in policy, very tried to do the right thing, and tried to do the right thing for the right reasons. I think if there's criticism, it will be that he wasn't enough of a politician, that he didn't do enough golfing with members of Congress and arm twisting and those kinds of things. But he's, it's really hard to tell. I mean, my favorite story along those lines is someone once asked Churchill how history would treat his conduct of World War II, and his answer was, "Very well, I intend to write it." And of course he did. The 3-volume The Gathering Storm.
Churchill's histories treat Churchill
Very well, extremely well. So maybe Obama ought to do the same thing. Anyway, anything else? I'm still having my rib dinners. That's become an institution.
All right.
Oh yeah, I'm up to I think 45. I've had 45. We're closing in on 50 senators, and that's Well, here's a story. I've gotten votes from Republicans. I had an experience. Tim Kaine and I had an amendment on the budget, and we needed 6 or 7 Republican votes. It was 1 in the morning, and we got them. And I thought, well, that's great. We won. We got our amendment. We got, And then I looked at the Republicans the next day, and I realized they were all people that I had personal relationships with. It wasn't a random group of Republicans. It was McCain, Lindsey Graham, Susan Collins, Kelly Ayotte, maybe Richard Burr, I can't remember. But in other words, I hate to disillusion you guys, but relationships really matter. And it didn't come to me till the next day, and I looked at the list and I said, yeah, those are all people that I, spend some time with. So I'm, and I have a new official position in the Senate. You guys should treat me with more respect. I'm the official introducer of speakers at the prayer breakfast every Wednesday morning. My job is to introduce the senator who's speaking. Every week a different senator speaks. And my job is to do research on their background and reveal facts that people don't know about their high school football exploits or something. So, but that's my favorite hour of the week. It's the only bipartisan event.
What kind of turnout do you get for those?
It's usually between 20 and 30. Pretty good. And it's more Republicans, more Baptists. I think me and Sheldon Whitehouse are the only Episcopalians. Chuck always comes. Blumenthal is usually there, so we have some Jews. Ornhatch is a Mormon. Harry's a Mormon. I introduced Harry as the world's only liberal Mormon.
No Catholics?
There are lots of Catholics.
Oh, all right.
Susan's a Catholic, which I didn't really realize. And Joe Donnelly, there are a lot of Catholics. They show up on Ash Wednesday because you have the little mark.
Is that on C-SPAN? That sounds interesting.
It's totally closed.
Oh, really?
No staff, no press.
Yeah.
And I like it for 3 reasons. One, it's a quiet moment in the midst of this craziness. Secondly, as I mentioned, it's the only bipartisan event of the week. Mm-hmm. One of the problems with the place is the institutionalization of partisanship. Every day at lunch is a partisan lunch. The Democrats don't have anything on Wednesday, but the Republicans have a partisan lunch Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And the third reason, my favorite reason, is each week a different senator is asked to speak. And ostensibly it's about your faith. But inevitably it's autobiographical. And you end up learning, for example, I've noticed, and this is totally unscientific, a disproportionate number of U.S. senators come from single-parent homes. My dad died when I was 2. My parents divorced when I was 5. My mother died when I was 4. My dad raised us. I never knew my dad. I've had a couple of those. Which is, I think, really interesting. I don't know what to make of that, but I think it's interesting. The other thing that's interesting is they all are regular people. They're just, middle class, some lower middle class, working class. Tim Scott from South Carolina, his mother was on welfare, I'm pretty sure. Lindsey Graham was raised above a bar and pool room. Parents died when he was a teenager. He raised his sister. Orrin Hatch, this dignified, tall, he looks like a patrician, was raised in a house outside of Pittsburgh that had dirt floors and no indoor plumbing. And the front wall of the house was a billboard that his father had scrounged and cut windows and doors in. Harry Reid was raised in a house with no indoor plumbing.
His father was a miner?
He did a bunch of things. I think he was a miner. He was, and he committed suicide, which Harry talked about in his farewell address the other day. Very rough-hewn guy. It's one of the reasons Harry talked about supporting the Affordable Care Act, because his father had issues that were never dealt with because he never had any access to medical care. But it's kind of reassuring, even though they're different politically and ideologically, that it isn't some kind of inherited aristocracy. I mean, Jay Rockefeller, okay, but I find it reassuring, and I've had fun doing the introductions because I learn, I learn, and there are two of us that do it, and my partner, we alternate. I do 2 weeks. My partner is Jeff Sessions. He was the other guy that did the introductions. But anyway, so I'm still embarked on this idea of getting to know people and getting to know them outside. I had one situation at a dinner where I had two. One of the senators said, he was sitting next to the guy at dinner, and he looked over and he looked at me and said, I've seen this guy around here for 8 years. This is the first time we've ever talked. Wow. And I said, in my head, I said, bingo, that's the idea here. So it's my own little project, and Peaches at Kenny's, if you call Kenny's Smoke Shop and order 2 racks of ribs, mild on the side, coleslaw and beans, Peaches will say, anything else, Senator King? She knows me.
Thanks for listening to the Press Herald Podcast. For more information on this and other Portland Press Herald podcasts, visit pressherald.com/podcasts. The Portland Press Herald Podcast is also available to subscribe on iTunes. Just search for Press Herald Podcast.